Hello, I'm back here for a second video in a row this month. This video is more of a breakdown, not so much a tutorial on how I created this scene that I posted on Twitter. I'm probably showing it right now in the to you guys, the full render, compositing and all. Um, I want to say that this is not a tutorial and this is just a breakdown of what went into the scene for people to know more or less my process, but also, maybe get a new understanding of a process of how to build a scene using geometry nodes. Since at first, even though geometry nodes can do so many things, it's kind of hard to understand how to make them all connect together to work as in one scene. So with that, let's get started, and we'll start now. All right, so to get started, we're gonna first do a little overview of what's in the scene, and if you see here in my collection, we start with just the base plane. This entire mesh is just based on a single plane. There is no well, uh, I don't want to say the entire mesh because I do have assets such as the car here. This is not connected to the mesh, and the birds in the background. This is just something I imported using Sketchfab. But the plane, the fence, the terrain, the rocks, those are all, and the grass, those are all in the same node system. Even the car is influenced a little bit by the node system, but we'll get to that later. So from there, we see that I use Botaniq. The Botaniq is an add-on created by Polynic, I forget their name, but I will surely post a link in the description below for you guys to check them out. Very useful, and it allows me to import grass assets, trees, flowers in different seasons. And currently I have an outdated version. They just released an update today for, as a matter of fact, that I did not. But they bring also animated assets and just the whole shebang. They also have a scattering section in their add-on. However, I don't use this. I prefer to create my own scatter system in order to have more fine control over what I am looking for. But this is definitely good if you just want to get a quick grasp on terrain. I believe it uses geometry nodes now. It used to use particle systems, but now it uses geometry nodes. So from here we have uh, rocks, which I just used by using the default rock generator in Blender. I don't remember if you have to activate an add-on for this, but I think it's default in Blender. They come untextured and with no UV, so you do have to add a texture and a UV to them. The birds, as I said before, they came from Sketchfab, which I used the Sketchfab add-on, to which if I activate the add-on, allows me to search the Sketchfab for Creative Commons attribution or other uh, models. So like if I search bird, I can find different bird models I can use. In that case, I think you could find the ones I use on the next page or somewhere. But you get the idea. I'm able to import assets that I can use in my projects. Um, you do have to read very carefully what you're allowed to use them. Some of them say Creative Commons attribution means you can use. If, as far as I know, it means it's a CC0, but some of them is a CC0 limited, so it's means you can only use it in commercial projects, which this is a non-commercial project, as I didn't make this for an advertisement or anything of the sorts. I just made it to make it. So let's see here. What else we have? We have this car, which also is a 3D scan. imported from Sketchfab using the same plugin. The fence down below is also imported from Sketchfab. I just look for a wooden fence because I think it would fit the scene. However, this is easily modeled by yourself as well. You could even make it in geometry nodes and link that up into the chain, but I didn't do that because, well, I didn't need to waste time. I knew the look I was going for, so I just looked for a model that already existed. So now here we have uh, the entire scene. I just chose a camera angle, used the depth of field as you guys saw in the picture to focus, to bring everything out of focus and create a depth look. However, bringing all of these assets together using geometry nodes did take a lot of time and a lot of noodles, as you can see from the node tree, but I will do my best to sort of show you all. So first let me hide the non-geometry nodes assets, so the car and the birds, uh, and that will alleviate a little bit the scene as well, because they're pretty heavy. So let's start by first deleting the group output here and creating a new group output over here and bringing these in just so you can see how it starts. I started with a simple plane. If I bring in the, I forget what this is called, the overlays, you can see that it's a simple subdivision plane. I believe I used something like 25 by 25 subdivision grid. Um, However, you can go as far as your computer can handle. I just have a simple sun in the scene and a guide for the fence. I will explain more on that guide later. Okay, so with a simple plane, subdivided plane, I started by where anyone would start, just creating that terrain that I like using what I've explained in my mountain tutorial, which I will link as well. Um, I created a displacement using a scale by the normal, multiplied it, and added on top two Musgrave textures. You can use noise or whatever, and based on their color value, it would detect an elevation and give us a ground. In this case, I was satisfied with this kind of ground look, very gentle, not too uh, mountainous. But I will continue on. After that, I added this material node. Now you can't see it now since I am in solid view, but if I go into render view, you can see I add a procedural material I created in Blender. I assign it toward to the ground. This is just because I also use other materials, and you can sort of see it here. Let's see if I can zoom in close enough and that YouTube picks it up. You can see that there's this jagged edge. I use a factor that I picked out that's called path, which I manually weight painted. There's also a way to do this procedurally, but I decided to do it manual since I knew what I was looking for, called path. Now I'm not sure why it's not showing up. Could be because I am in no. Well, I have a weight paint that's basically the path. And it's not showing up, but trust me that it's there. Or actually, it might be in Vertex Paint. No, it's not in Vertex Paint. I do not know why it's not showing up, but it's there. And moving on, this basically leads into here, which allows me to separate the two paths by simply outputting the Boolean I call path and using that into the socket here to separate the two. It's it's a bit more complicated than that, but I will But you can look up more detailed tutorials on how to do that. I'm still learning that one myself as I had to look it up to figure it out, but we learn as we go. After that, I decided I didn't actually add these nodes in yet, so I'm actually gonna mute them. But I created a my first scatter, which was the grass texture. Now here you see I scattered grass on a plane. Let me go into here based on the selection of path, which is again the weight paint that I added, connecting it all the way back here into the input and changing the density to the selection to path. I also inverted the selection by using a utilities boolean math and setting it to not. I'm able to invert the boolean so it picks everything outside of the weight paint and use that as my scatter points. After that, I instance the grass and, based on a random value, random rotation only on the z-axis, so it's not doing 360s on me. And it's not anything complicated. You can see here with just a collection info to source the grass collection that I have inside of Botaniq here. I have the grass collection and combine x, y, z in order to isolate the z value and input a random value from 0 to 5, so to get random rotation only on the z value for the plants. And then this I will explain later. Once I got my grass in and merged it up into my now the fence, it's a little bit trickier to explain. So the fence is a little bit tricky, but as you see, as I told you before, I brought in this Boolean guide. Simply Shift A, bring in a Boolean, not a Boolean, a Bezier curve. My bad. But on this Bezier curve, I bring it into the geometry nodes by simply clicking and dragging, um, dropping it into the node network, and using its original geometry, I put it into a set position in order to mold it into or change its positions based off of the displaced ground. Using a transfer attribute set to float, I grab the density, or no, the value from the multiply in the terrain, bring it straight into the transfer attribute in order to transfer that offset into the set position, allowing the curve to form based off of the bumpiness of the ground. Now keep in mind, if you go too mountainous, it will break. And if you go too mountainous, you wouldn't need a fence anyways, so that makes sense. After that, I resample the curve in order for the curve to, because right now on this point, we only have a 0 and 1 point as shown here. If I hit tab, we only have 2 points. But here we resample the curve in order to have multiple points. In fact, if I lower here, you can see I get less detail. However, I'm not going to do that. After that, I put curves. I put a curve to point node, allowing me to instance on point the fence objects. Now, since I only used one single fence object, I didn't need to bring in the collection. However, if you have multiple fence objects that link together, you would bring a collection instead of just the object. Here I did a little bit of a math thingy with booleans. Not this. This is just aligning the rotation so it rotates the fence based on the elevation and to follow each other so that it doesn't look weird. If I were to change this, you could see that the rotation would be weird. In fact, if I just mute this node, this is how it looks by default by just plugging in that tangent. If I disconnect the line, you'll see that they all just become weird. So align to vector, you can find this in utilities, align Euler to vector. Let's get rid of that one. Now here we have a Boolean node that is set to not, so you know I'm already inverting something, and I'm bringing the attribute of the path Boolean that I created earlier into a transfer attribute in order to transfer that into this instance and tell it wherever that path was that we originally created, which I will show you right now. So wherever, not there, here. Let me disconnect that. Wherever there's no grass, I created a weight painted path. So wherever there is that weight painted path, I told Blender to not put a a fence there. So if I were to adjust this curve, you could see the fence disappears based off of certain paths and weight paints. So that's one way. It's a little bit difficult to show, especially when I don't have a merge node. You can see that based off of where I am rotating this fence, the fence will disappear if it hits a path that has been weight painted. The grass will also get smaller, but that is something else that I did, and that is that I took the realized instance of the fence, and based on a proximity on the proximity to the fence, I map ranged it so that the grass will grow smaller the closer it gets to the fence as it does in real life, because the fence takes up its ground and its root. So naturally the fence would impede on some growth. Now if we continue on, I added rocks. Now how did I do the rocks? I will show you. Let me quickly disconnect this. Move this up here. Now if I were to show the rocks, you see it follows the path pretty damn close. Now how did I do this is actually a little bit tricky. I had to first bring in the original geometry, the no grass, no nothing, just the geometry, displaced geometry after the terrain. Once I brought that in, I immediately deleted the geometry. I will actually see if I could show you that. So if I mute these nodes and mute these nodes, it doesn't, oh wait, these, okay. Let me see if I could simply just link this one. So you see that I deleted it in a way where if I mute these, based off of the density of the geometry node, and all I did to get the density was add this into the socket and then disconnect it, because I didn't need it connected, and then told the density to become path. After that, I had access to the path on the density channel without actually having it affect the actual density of my grass. You could also do it another way, but that's the way I've always done it, so I just do it that way. Unmuting these, you can see that I used a color ramp in order to isolate a certain path, and then I inverted that selection by just flipping the color ramp and adjusting it so that only the lines and some faces remain. From there, I fed it into the selection of the geometry, into the selection of the delete node, and it only deleted the parts that I didn't want. Once I got to that point, I converted the whole thing into a mesh to curve, allowing me to instance points on it. And then once I instance points, I just placed the rocks, adjusted the random size. Here I did set a position and based it off of the density yet again, so that I can adjust the randomness. You can see the random. And I did this based on the density, which is density, I call density, but it's really just the path. So it's following the path normal, I guess. It's scaling on the normal. So once I did that, I had my basic scene built up. So if I were to go back into this join and put in the rocks, you see I have pretty much my scene, except I wanted a bit more natural, I guess. So I didn't want only the rocks to be on the edges. I also wanted them to appear on the path itself. So what I did was, based on the density, I color ramped it to be a bit more selective and placed, well, I just placed rocks on the path. There's no rocket science to this. Uh, Based on the selection of the path. So if you remember the weight paint, I placed the weight paint on the everything that's being marked off as a path. And from there, I just raise my density or not. So give it a random value, just a simple uh, distribution, nothing complex. After that, I separated another path, did another scatter, same thing. Just made sure that it's on the knot of the path in order for it to come up with the grass, and this is just the flowers. And I also and let me show you how that looks. You can see some flowers popped up, and I also added their proximity in order to not so in order for them to grow smaller if they get close to the fence. I don't think you actually see this in the render, but it definitely adds more detail in case you do see them. Now, after this, I added a sunflower. Now, why did I separate the sunflower from the regular flowers? Is because I realized that and remembered that sunflowers, they always point towards where the sun is, thus the name sunflower. Um, and they're famous for that. If you see those time lapses, which I'll probably find a royalty-free video for you to see here, maybe. We'll see. Maybe I'm creative enough for that. But I wanted to get the same result. So what I did was connect. Let me show you actually, so I can. So what I did in order for the flower to face the sun was on my sun lamp that I've imported just basically using Shift A, grabbed the sun, dragged it into the node network, and that's it. I took the rotation of the sun, ran it through an aligned Euler to vector based on the z, and that's it. The rest is just the same, the scattering effect that I use throughout. There's nothing different between these scattering effects, except that this one just is on the path, so it doesn't have the not uh, Boolean in order to invert it, but that's the same. And then whenever I turn this sun, which I currently have on a driver, if I go into the world, I used a sky texture, so I connected the driver of of the sun rotation to the sun Z. So if I rotate this sun and then I update here, you'll see that my flowers turned ever so slightly to face the opposite direction of where that sun is. Now let me reset that. The only bad thing of this is that it is not a an automatic update. Whenever you update the sun rotation, you do have to click on the sun value in order for it to update. So it does take a bit, but it works for a still image, and I believe in renders it does update every frame. So that's something to take into consideration. Back into this node network. We already got 90% of the way there. But I decided and remember that, hey, the edges of where the rocks meet the grass, these looks too perfect. There's no bump. Whenever you see a rocky path like this, the sides are always bumped a little bit upwards, or like a little mound to show that like dirt has been pushed aside to make this path. So in order to do that, I created this node network, which if I activate, you'll see elevates the path ever so slightly. If I were to exaggerate that, you see the rocks get elevated, de-elevated. But most importantly here, I can exaggerate this. It's not going to show here because I don't have it actually connected. I'm connected from the back, so let me actually... You can see I have an elevation. So I don't want to go too high because then it becomes blocky, as this is pretty sharp. So I just settle for 0.005. It has a very small bump, however you can still sort of see it. I could also push it up to maybe 0.9 and you'll see it more without having too much of geometry stretching. So I'm going to keep it at 0.005 though, or 0.005, so it's still the same scene. Now from here I am practically done, however I realized while looking at the render view that it is too clear. It is way too clear, and that it would need something to break that up, some sort of mist. However, I could have just added a cube and made it a volumetric object, use shaders materials in order to cut the volumetric to the halfway point and just adjust it there. That would have been perfectly possible. However, I wanted to do it using geometry nodes, using the points to volume, just to try it. Not saying the other way, or even making a cube and adding a volumetric material to that cube in the node itself is invalid. It's just I wanted to try this. So if we are to just delete this for a moment and cut off the connections, if I bring this in, you'll see we get just some mist. So let's break down what this mist is. So first I brought in a cube. I subdivided that cube using mesh subdivide, or subdivide mesh to a level 5. This just subdivided the mesh as if you just press tabbed, right click, subdivide. It's not subdivision surface. It's it doesn't create a sort of like rounder edge. After that, I distributed points on the mesh, but based it off of a gradient texture that uses the position. And this just cuts it to basically cuts it in half. And use that as a selection in order for it to just cut it in half. After that, I just flipped it over I flipped it 90, or in this case, yeah, 90 degrees on its side, moved it a bit on the Z in order for the mist to be at the level of the camera that I want. I then converted the points to volume, and that's how I got my mist, which you can now see if I cut these out, bring everything in, and render. You can see that there is a slight bit of mist, and my computer is a bit slow when it comes to rendering volumetrics. However, you can sort of tell that without it, let's show it, without, with, without, with, it does add a bit more depth to it. Like if there's volumetric atmosphere, that's what you call it. Now, let's head back into solid view. After I got things looking the way I wanted, I moved this curve enough times to satisfy my cravings for moving curves. Because if just to show you again, if I move this curve, if I even rotate this curve, you can see the path changes and the composition slightly changes too. Not the path, the fence changes and the grass and the different positions of the fences. Uh, After that, I just messed with the seed of the sunflower the most. If I were to go into the sunflower, you see I went up to seed 46 because I couldn't find a seed that I particularly like, and then I found this one and said, you know what if we made the sunflower the focus? But then after seeing the background, I said the background looks way too empty. So that's when I went to Sketchfab and brought in a car. Uh, Now the car does have a little bit of geometry nodes on it, and it's a bit heavy because it is a 3D scan, so it has thousands of polygons. But if I were to select the car, you can see it does have a geometry node system on it. All that geometry nodes system is telling it is, well, one, I set up a switch node. If you watch my switch node tutorial, you'll know that that if I switch this to a cube, let me show you. Switching it back lags it because it has to reload all that geometry. So you can imagine what moving it does. If I even move it one, like it doesn't move. It takes forever to load. This is inefficient. So what I did was, using the switch node, I created a cube in the same direction as. I know that this is where the hood of the car is, this is where the trunk of the car is, and more or less this is like the angle of it. So using that, I was able to rotate and translate it about. I could translate it without lagging my system, and then when it's time, I just hit switch. Now, I don't know if there's a way to oh, I could just use an is viewport, and then when I hit render, I think it would actually convert that to a car. However, I've never tested this, so I'll tell you more about this if it works after the video, probably in the bonus, so stick around. Alright, so continuing on, I then translated the entire thing using a transform node to its position that I want. And after that, I used a set position set to the location of the plane, and this basically allowed me to um, set the origin position of this car based off of the plane's elevation. Origin and relative does completely different things, so you got to be careful with that. and it offsets the car's position to match the elevation. This does break if you go too far, so you want to be careful. And so, but then again, I wasn't looking for something 100% foolproof on every situation. I just wanted something that worked in this case because I already had an idea of what I was visually looking for. If you didn't and wanted more options, you would need to expand and do more complicated node work. So let's switch this back to a car. And let's see what else. So after this, I I saw the render once again, saw the scene, and still thought that the sky was empty. I didn't like that the sky was so empty and a lot of negative space. So I decided to break it up by importing a couple of birds. Now these birds are very low poly. However, they're far and out of focus, so they work for my purposes. If I were to select them and zoom in, you could see they are very low poly, very basic birds. But at a distance and blurred out, they work just fine. Um, yeah, after that, it was just setting up the materials and the world, just messing around with the sun, the elevation, the intensity, the direction, messing with my camera, adding depth of fields. I picked a focal length of 80 because it just fit the scene a little bit. I didn't want to go too wide because that's now taking a picture of like a mountain or something huge, but I didn't want to go too narrow because then that's more like a close-up. And I added depth of field, based it off of a distance closer to the camera, set my blades to 5 in order to make a little bit of a bokeh effect. My f-stop to 2.8 was good enough for the blur, and I left everything else on default. Uh, Now, my sun actually doesn't have any strength because I'm using the sky texture sun. I'm only using the sun to import the rotation from the sky texture into geometry nodes, since there's currently no way of me actually getting this rotation into geometry nodes without some sort of loop around that I don't know of yet. Now for materials. Materials, I'm going to start here, select the ground, and we will talk about materials. Alright, so now we're going to be looking at the material of the ground. I didn't really texture a lot of these things because the grass already comes textured from Botaniq. The flowers too. Sketchfab, for the most part, brings in already textured materials. You might have to adjust them slightly. Say this car, I had to adjust its materials in order to be more metallic and include the bump, and add more Musgrave and mask out a couple things. However, for the most part, it comes already textured. The fences as well, I didn't really add much to it since it's not really that complicated, and it looked just fine. I just increased the bump a little bit, the strength of the normal bump a little bit. The rocks, I used a rock texture. Um, Actually, I didn't select the rocks, so here you go. The rocks, I used the rock texture, and using Node Wrangler, I Control-Shift-T and imported all my textures in at once, connected them all to the right sockets, and yeah, it's just a simple rock texture with a hue saturation, just to the saturation that I feel fit the scene the most, and the value and hue. But after that comes the most complicated, which was the ground. The ground was a bit more complicated. I imported the attribute of path in order to serve as a mask to give the value of the path itself a different value than the grass covered dirt, as this path has been exposed to more sunlight, it would be lighter than the ones covered in darkness. At least in my thoughts. I don't know if that's actually how dirt works, but I think it looks nicer that way. Since I am using geometry nodes, I am not able to use to displace this ground. I am not able to use UV textures or texture maps because at this current stage, geometry nodes doesn't support UV textures. So what I did was instead create a procedural setting using noise, a couple of color mixes, and ambient occlusion, just your basic procedural shader in order to get a believable dirt path. The dirt path in the end doesn't get seen that much since this is being seen in the grass a little bit, but it works for my purposes and doesn't look too bad. So that is all I could think of right now of the basics that I did for the material. There is nothing special really about it, but you can see that finding ways to connect different scene elements into Blender, mostly scatter. I mean, I have one, two, three, four basic scattering systems with only slight tweaks in order to get them to work the way I want to. The only complex scattering system I would say is this edge rock, which used the edges of the path. This fence isn't even scattered on the path itself, is scattered on an instance of the Bezier curve I imported in order to control it a bit better. Um, and then this is just the volumetric, which isn't that complicated either. I just basically made a cube and made it into a volumetric. Uh, but that is all. After that, I hit render and rendered out my scene. I did not composite in Blender. If you look at my compositing tab, I haven't rendered anything out now. I might do that actually. So let me pause this or stop recording, and I'll render a scene so I can show you. So I'm back here, and I didn't let this render out as much as I did in my, in the render that I posted. However, this is good enough. So all I have in my compositing right now is a render into the AI denoiser, which I prefer to use over the new open image denoiser in the render panel. Why do I do that? It's because I don't have an NVIDIA GPU, and really the open image denoiser isn't that great unless you have an NVIDIA GPU that supports it, that supports the newer AI denoiser, which is much better. But I don't have that. So using this denoiser, all I do is uh, is that I just export this as the raw image and then export some other passes using this denoiser. So after that, I just exported all of these passes into their own separate PNGs in a folder and basically composited in Photoshop. I did not use Blender compositing for anything. Now, I don't hate the Blender compositor. I think it's a great tool to already to add into a great open source software that's free and it's powerful. However, the compositor is slow. It is painfully slow. And that is because even like for example, if I were to reselect this, what it's doing is it's running this through here into here. Now, if I start adding more nodes, say like color, balance, now you can see down here, it's canceling and compositing from zero again. And this doesn't look too bad, and I was just willy-nilly. Um, what it does is it every time I add a new node, instead of starting from the previous node, so here, it starts from here. And it runs through the system again, meaning that the longer I go, adding filter, blur, there it goes canceling again, compositing, and there. Now, in this scene, it doesn't take forever, but it does, compared to Photoshop, which is instantaneous, you can see your changes as you do them, it leaves a lot to be desired. And when your node trees get long for VFX shots or very complicated color correction, it can really slow you down. So I prefer to just open Photoshop, import my passes, and work there. Now, to show you my render settings, all I rendered this at was at 35 samples. This example render that I did here, I only rendered 7, but I rendered the final version at 35 samples. My light paths, I left it at fast GL approximation, or GI, I don't know what that is. Only did viewport bounces of 2 and render bounces at 3. This is to save performance, and I didn't really need all the intensive bounces in this scene anyways. And then I left on performance, I turned on persistent data. What persistent data does is when you first render, it loads your textures and all your materials into Blender's memory. So anytime you hit render after that, if you have to re-render, it doesn't load in already saved in data again. That's how I understand it. I might be wrong, but that's how I understand it. So I always try to keep it ticked. This helps especially in animation or sequence shots. Uh, as for passes, I always have combined Z, mist, normal UV, and denoise on. Emission, environment, shadow, and ambient occlusion. Sometimes if I'm doing VFX shots, I'll have shadow catcher. I'll have some of these on as well if I need them. Position I barely use, but I have used position and vector before in order to remap some stuff. But all in all, you don't really need much more than these that I have on right now for your basic image render like these. Uh, Anything else? Oh yes, I did do the is viewport test, and it does seem to work. So if I add an is viewport into the geometry switch node in the viewport, I will see the cube, but once I hit render, it'll turn into the car. So as long as I'm confident that the car is in the right position and that everything looks okay, then I can just put an is viewport, save my viewport performance, work around it, and then hit render when I need to. Well, if I also want to add more control to this, I can switch. I can duplicate this switch node, make it a boolean, and it's a boolean within a boolean. So now if I set this to false and then switch it to true, other way around, my bad. It is now true, false, and I can have the switch node again, but if I keep this on the cube, it will stay that cube, but if I hit render and the cube is still there, it'll switch into the car. I wish I could show you that, but I'm actually going to try to show you that. And there, it worked. It switched the cube into the car, and I wish I used this in my original scene file. It would have saved me a little bit of a hassle in handling that car, but we know it works now. I'm probably going to do a little bit of a short video on it, one of those YouTube shorts. But for now, I think this has gone long enough. This has been my breakdown of this image and this noodle, this absolutely noodle of geometry nodes. But hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea of what goes into a scene, how quickly it can become so complicated, but at the same time, how seemingly different functions of geometry node can work together to bring a scene. I'm going to close this with just showing an image of the final render, and I'm going to go now. Bye.